And before I make my short welcoming comments, I'd like to invite my colleague, Shannon Graney, to say a few words. It was at Shannon's insistence and persuasion, it didn't take much of either, or both, that we did this event. And Carol Steiker came on board very quickly and helped us to put this day together. Shannon was our colleague at the Humanities Center, where she was director of fellowship programs and also of our publicity, did a wonderful job, and is now at Smith, training to be a psychiatric social worker. It really is wonderful to have one's colleagues suggesting important areas of discussion, because in that sense we get a sense that the institution is growing inwards as well as it's growing outwards. And that's been one of our very, very remarkable experiences at the center. So Shannon, please come. Let me welcome you and kiss you in public.
I couldn't be more delighted to be here today, and I'm truly grateful to Homie for inviting me to say a few words. I'm standing here because I played a small but significant role in the planning of this event. I brought the issue to the table at the Mahinder Center. And I mean that literally. I literally brought an issue of the New Yorker to the table at one of the center's staff lunches. While Homie was attempting to enjoy his meal, I was urging him to, preferably right then and there, read Adam Gopnik's essay, The Caging of America, in which Gopnik reviewed Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and William Stuntz's The Collapse of American Criminal Justice. The essay, and in particular the analysis of William Stuntz's work, had so thoroughly persuaded me of the profound importance and immediacy of the issue of mass incarceration that I felt compelled to convince my colleagues to address the topic with a public event. Of course, my mission was easy, and it took no effort at all to convince Homie or my colleagues that mass incarceration is a topic well worth the center's time and resources. The prison system in the United States is so self-evidently broken, its results are so grim, that there is no doubt about the need not just for discussion, but for discussion that seeks understanding, thus today's panel, How Did We Get Here?, and solutions, which will be addressed in the panel, How Do We Get Out? The Mahinder Center is an ideal site for this conversation. The Mahinder Center does not simply offer the humanities as a way to understand the human condition. Rather, the center recognizes the value in the exchange of ideas, and it strives to be a true crossroads at Harvard, a place where people from a range of disciplines can come together and think collaboratively. If ever there was one, mass incarceration is a topic that calls for interdisciplinary collaboration. The problems of our failed prison system are broad and complex, including racism, class prejudice, narratives of criminality, priorities of resource allocation, access to power, and so on. As a result, it is imperative to utilize a variety of tools and a range of perspectives in order to begin untangling the origins and impact of mass incarceration. Today's event is an excellent model for such discussions. While I am thankful to have played a part in this event, my role was solely in its inception. None of us would be in this room without the vision and commitment of Carol Steiker, Homie, and Steve Beal, the skilled implementation of the staff, Mary, Sarah, Neil, Kevin, and Boraj, or the generosity of the panelists. Your hard work is important, and I thank you.
Thank you for your very, very moving words, Shannon, and for proving that there is never a free lunch. But this one, that lunch was memorable, and I'm delighted you're here with us today. Bernard Harcourt asked me at lunch, when did your interest in incarceration start? And I thought about it and said, I think it started at some point, and I will talk about the point of origin, but when I read Adorno's statement that he is more worried about fascistic tendencies within social democracy than fascist movements outside it, that's when I really thought, what the hell are we doing? And where are we when our civility is underlined quite often by this kind of barbarism? And as with civility and barbarism, there isn't a solution, one or the other, a simple one. But at least it puts us in both places to try and understand what the criminal justice system does and how we might work with it, how we might work against it, and what alternatives there may be to it. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Mahindra Center this afternoon to discuss a matter of grave political and legal importance that is also an ethical issue, a humane issue, burdened with the vicissitudes and vulnerabilities of human character. I want to thank Shannon, as I have, for bringing the idea to us, Carol Steiker for her wise guidance, Sarah Razor for logistic virtuosity as always, and my colleague Larry Bobo and all of our panelists for giving their time and sharing. I also want to thank my executive director, the wonderful Steve Beale, who is a great foil to a confused, disorganized, and impetuous director. Thank you. This is the latest in a series of very productive collaborations between the Mahindra Center and the Law School under the rubric of the legal humanities that explore intersections between the law, literature, film, ethics, history, and hermeneutics. We stand, all of us, in the shadow of the prison house because the prison system puts all members of society, fair and foul, on trial. I learned this on my way home from school in Bombay when we drove past Arthur Bunda Road Jail. The traffic would be stopped. The cacophonous Bombay street would fall strangely silent, and groups of disheveled men with fettered feet were herded cattle-like into waiting vans. The jailers hollowed and gesticulated as if they were driving away evil spirits. The inquisitive crowd soon looked away as if there was some evil eye at play and they should not be witnessing it. There was something prescribed at which they should not be looking at. And I, excited by the real-life presence of robbers and cops, suddenly felt a kind of crumbling within. My adolescent ambivalence was acute. This is surely an act of law and order, but what makes it also a spectacle of shame? Old cities held prisons in their midst like gardens of evil. Today, prisoners are largely located in the invisible, interminable expanse between cities, although they are everywhere to be seen in movies and on television. From the perspective of the humanities, I wonder how imprisoned the public imagination has become, how trite and commonplace it seems to read a tragic sentence like the following one from The Atlantic. I quote, "The US incarceration rate has more than quadrupled since 1980. It's now the highest in the world, just ahead of Russia and Rwanda. It is estimated that approximately 2.3 million Americans are now behind bars. This is about 1/4 of all the incarcerated people on Earth, though the US represents only 1/20 of the world's population. When the figures for those under probation and parole are added, about 1 in 18 US men is under some form of monitoring or control. The figure for blacks is 1 in 11. While lawyers, politicians, and policymakers debate the issue of mass incarceration, those of us in the arts and humanities strive to find a way in which we can discover a language of public affect, a communicative discourse of citizenly emotion and identification to temper the discourse around criminal justice in the public sphere. We thank you, our panelists and our audience, for helping us this afternoon to listen to our better selves. A year or two after my experience at Arthur Bunda Jail in Bombay, I read these lines about a jail in an English city, Reading, that lies on the banks of the Thames between London and Oxford. It'll be familiar to some of you. I know not whether laws be right or whether laws be wrong. All that we know who lie in jail is that the wall is strong, and that each day is like a year whose days are long. But this I know, that every law that men hath made for man, since first man took his brother's life, and the sad world began, but straws the wheat and saves the chaff with a most evil fan. This too I know, and wise it were if each could know the same, that every prison that men build is built with bricks of shame, and bound with bars lest Christ should see how men them brothers maim. In Reading jail, by Reading town, there is a pit of shame, and in it lies a wretched man, eaten by teeth of flame. In a burning, winding sheet he lies, and his grave has got no name. Oscar Wilde. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Homi, and thank you, Shannon and Steve and Sarah, for organizing this wonderful event, and thank you, of course, to the wonderful Mahindra Center that brings us all together on such important topics. I am very delighted to participate in this important event and to chair this extraordinarily illustrious panel of diverse, and you will shortly see, very engaging authorities. The problem of what has come to be called the American practice of mass incarceration is one of the most pressing issues of our time, as it affects the life prospects of millions of individual Americans and profoundly shapes in many negative ways the experience of their wider communities. These communities are disproportionately poorer communities of color, and thus mass incarceration is not only a reflection of our society's substantial and growing inequality, but it has also become one of the prime engines of American inequality, deepening and entrenching pre-existing inequalities along the lines of class, race, and ethnicity. It's really no exaggeration to call mass incarceration the civil rights issue of our time. Now, it hasn't always been this way. Previous generations have called other things the civil rights issues of their times. Indeed, as a law student here in the 1980s, I believe I called gay rights the civil rights issue of the time in my law school thesis, or third-year paper, as we called it then. And I think I was vindicated in that assessment by the events of the next few decades, so perhaps you'll accept my authority on this call. But in the early 1980s, when I went to law school, the trend toward mass incarceration and the massive increases in the American incarceration rate, they were in their relative infancies. And the crisis has only become apparent after this trend has continued and accelerated for several more decades. Now, despite the importance of this massive change in the American incarceration rate and incarceration practices, the scale of this change relative to our own prior practices and relative to the practices of our peer nations is surprisingly invisible. especially among the more affluent and more educated people in this country, by which I mean you, dear audience, and my students and myself before I began to study this. So I've taught criminal law to first-year law students for more than 20 years here at Harvard, and I often ask them early in their first year of legal education to identify for me, you know, what the biggest social changes in American society have been during their lifetimes, just what the biggest things that have changed in our society during their own living memory or the decades immediately prior to them. Immediately, I get social media, right? Technology and the changes in social media. I almost always get gay rights and global warming. But virtually no one identifies the changes in America's incarceration practices as a really big change that occurred in their lifetime. And yet what has happened in our own country has been nothing short of a revolution that massively affects poor communities of color, but as I think Homie very eloquently pointed out, affects all of us in our society and the prospects for promoting equality in our society. Thus, what I'm going to do is a very brief slideshow that will set the table, if you will, for the rest of the speakers on this panel in briefly sketching the nature and the scale of the recent American Revolution in punishment practices. So, as you can see from this slide, for most of the 20th century, the American incarceration rate bobbed along at roughly 100 per 100,000 incarcerated, maybe a little above, but similar to the average incarceration rate of other Western liberal democracies, i.e. the other countries that we think of as our peers. Indeed, the lack of variation in the incarceration rate over time for most of the century and across countries was so striking that two criminologists published a paper on what they called the theory of the stability of punishment, a paper that sociologist Frank Zimring has called the most ironically timed article on imprisonment, published as it was in 1973. Just check out 1973 on this graph. Just as these criminologists were explaining how there was a kind of inevitability to 100 per 100,000 incarcerated, the American incarceration rate takes off and assumes its current geometric shape. And what you can see on this graph is that the American imprisonment rate has increased fivefold from around 100 per 100,000 to over 500 per 100,000. And if you add in those incarcerated in our nation's jails as well as our prisons, the rate tops 700 per 100,000 Americans incarcerated. Now, if you look, this is the rate per 100,000. If you look at raw numbers of those incarcerated, you see the same thing, the same geometric shape. If you go back to around 1970, there were about 300,000 people incarcerated. And if you look today, there are about 2,300,000 people incarcerated. So in the past 40 years, just an enormous, enormous change in raw numbers. Then if you look at the United States in world perspective, as Homie mentioned, we have 22% of the world's prisoners, but only 5% of the world's population, making us the #1 incarcerator in the world. I once published an op-ed on this topic and got amazing when you publish op-eds, got like hundreds of emails in response, one of which just said USA, USA, which wasn't what I was intending to evoke, but what you can see on this slide is the U.S. In the world. We are the world's leading jailer, ahead of Russia, ahead even, this shows only rate per 100,000. We are actually also in raw numbers the leading incarcerator, above even, amazingly, China, which is not on this graph. It's usually not included because China's numbers are thought to be suspect, as they don't include many people who are incarcerated in non-criminal forms of detention, but in some form of re-education of some kind or another. So China's numbers of those actually detained may actually be much larger, but their reported prison population in raw numbers is lower than ours, and China's a lot bigger. This shows the incarceration rate is not spread evenly across groups in American society. It has a very, very powerful disparate impact on racial and ethnic minorities, with the strongest impact on African Americans. What's more, and this is, I think, the most stunning slide of these slides, is that the disparate impact, the racial disparate impact, has gotten enormously different over time. So you can see the incarceration rates for whites is that orange line, and the incarceration rates for blacks is the green line right above it. Compare the difference in incarceration rates between blacks and whites in 1930, in pre-civil rights America, and the difference in the black and white incarceration rate today. Just a huge change. Today, there is far more racial disproportion in our criminal justice practices than there was before Martin Luther King was born, which is a stunning thing to say about American society. One way to think about mass incarceration or disproportionate impact is to compare the chance of spending time in prison for different racial and ethnic groups. So for African American men, they have a much, much higher chance of spending time in prison than the average for all Americans. And you can see how it goes up to first for Hispanics and then for African American men. If you look at African American men who do not complete high school, the chance of spending time in prison is about 60%. So it is what sociologists call a modal experience. That is the most common experience for African American men who do not graduate from high school to spend time in prison. In contrast, that chance back in the 1960s, as the civil rights movement was just getting started, was below 20%. If you look at the comparison between spending, the numbers, this is just numbers, we're going to get to spending in a minute, between the numbers of African American men who go to prison versus who go to higher education institutions, and the change in those numbers over time, you can see that there's been a much, much larger change in the number of African American men going to prison than in the number of African American men going to college, with prison outstripping college by more than 4 times, a factor of 4. These numbers are reflected in state budgets. So if you compare state budgets, their growth along higher education and corrections lines, once again, corrections changes far outstrip higher education increases by an even greater factor than the number of people going to prison. This is just an example from one state, Ohio, but it's very reflective of states' experience nationwide. And this is an illustration of the widely repeated point that it costs more to fund a year in prison than it costs to fund a year in college, prison versus Princeton. Note, we're not using Princeton for any tendentious reasons here, just it alliterates nicely with prison versus Princeton. It's a lot more expensive to go to prison for a year than to go to Princeton. And this slide also illustrates the differential over time between corrections spending and higher ed spending across the country, and the exceptional nature of the United States and the world in terms of its incarceration rate versus its imprison rate. We are the 6th in the world in terms of college degree attainment, behind Russia, Canada, Israel, Japan, and New Zealand. But we're number 1 in incarceration, USA. This differential between college and prison has enormous impacts on the lives of millions of Americans. The life chances of incarcerated prisoners, even people who've been to prison for a relatively short time, the average sentence that an American spends in prison is about 18 months. So even people who go to prison for relatively short times have their life chances affected along virtually every dimension. This slide shows the effect on employment and wages, which is considerable, but the chances for marriage and for avoiding divorce if marriage, as well as physical and mental health, are affected, as are the life chances of the children of those whom we imprison. So the question for today is, how did this enormous change, this revolution, if you will, happen? And what can be done about it? This panel will address the question, how did we get here, from a variety of perspectives. Each of our 4 panelists will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we will have the opportunity for questions and a more wide-ranging discussion and conversation among the panelists. I'm going to introduce them one by one as they come up. I'll introduce Professor Paul Butler from here, and then I'll introduce our other 3 panelists from my seat as they take the podium. Professor Paul Butler, I love to say Professor Paul Butler since he was my law school classmate many years ago, is a professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center, and he researches and teaches in the area of criminal law, race relations law, and critical theory. He is a former federal prosecutor who's written a wonderful book called Let's Get Free, A Hip-Hop Theory of Justice. The most provocative chapter I'll just flag for you is a chapter entitled something like, Can You Be a Good Person and a Good Prosecutor? To which his answer is no. So just, just to stir things up a little bit. He's one of my favorite people to listen to, as is everyone on this panel. I've been on panels with every person on this panel, and they are wonderful. But I'm going to invite Paul Butler up for
now. Thanks to Carol and Homie for this very important conference. I want to reflect for a few minutes on what it means to live in an age with 1 black president and 1 million black people in prison. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. My name is Paul Butler, and I represent the United States. That's how I used to start my opening statement. I represented the government in criminal court in the District of Columbia, and I used that power to put black men in prison, and women, and Latinos, and poor people. I became a prosecutor because I wanted to keep my community safe and whole. I stopped being a prosecutor because I wanted to keep my community safe and whole. When we think of black history, one frame that comes to mind is From Slavery to Freedom, which is what John Hope Franklin named his famous book. The way that story gets told is that African Americans have made slow but steady progress, from forced bondage to Jim Crow segregation to civil rights. Things aren't perfect now, but if you look at where we have been, the segregated schools, the lynchings, the separate water fountains, poll taxes, restrictive covenants, our absence from hallowed institutions like Harvard, we have in 2013 come a mighty long way. So this way of telling the story is sternly represented in the movie The Butler, in that climactic scene where we have this old black man who served 8 presidents, from Eisenhower to Reagan, in the White House, and experienced many hardships. He makes his way one last time to the Oval Office just to shake President Barack Obama's hand. And we don't get to hear the conversation between the 80-year-old African American and the leader of the free world. But I imagine it went something like this. Mr. President, my grandbaby is locked up. Many of his friends have caught cases as well. I never asked any of the presidents I served for anything, but I've never seen it this bad. Mr. President, please, is there anything you can do? For African Americans, the criminal justice system in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, those were the good old days. Then the black-white disparities were only about 2 to 1. Now the disparity between black and white men in prison is 7 to 1. John Hope Franklin would have had to rename his book from Slavery to Freedom to Prison. So what happened? Well, how did the African American community become the group target of state punishment during an era where there were a considerable number of racial justice victories? Think of the success of affirmative action, the tearing down of barriers to black political participation that led to the election of Barack Obama. Think of the ways that racism has become stigmatized. Think of Oprah as being one of the most influential women in the world. Think of the prominence of young black men in pop culture. And yet, the black incarceration rate tripled between 1980 and 2000. Now, in classic punishment theory, prison is for people who are the most dangerous or the most immoral. If we're allocating punishment correctly, you would think that something happened in the 1980s that made African Americans take a degenerate turn. Violent crime was actually going down during this time. So what's up with the blacks, as Justice Scalia likes to call us? The formal legal explanation attributes the responsibility for the dramatic rise in race disparities to two political and social developments. So one is the war on drugs, which evolved during this time from a focus on treatment to a focus on punishment, and very harsh punishment at that. So if you were to go to criminal court in DC today, you would think that white people don't use drugs. They're about 40% of the city's population, but they're absent largely from the drug courts. Now, this shouldn't surprise anybody on a college campus, but black people don't use drugs more than anybody else. I went to law school here, so I know that fact shouldn't surprise anybody on this university campus. The National Institute of Health reports that African Americans are about 13% of drug users. That's the same as our share of the population. There's good evidence that blacks don't sell drugs more than other groups either. It turns out, though, that we're about 13% of people who do the crime, but over half of people who do the time. There are a lot of theories about why and how the war on drugs focuses on blacks, but my point here is that it's one explanation for race disparities. And there's an interesting historical note as we start to think about whether drugs should be re-legalized. Re-legalized because for most of our history, it was perfectly legal to put some opium or cocaine in your body, just like now it's not a crime to put some prime rib or some chitlins in your body. Drugs started getting criminalized not because of concerns about health, but because of race. The first drug law was against opium in San Francisco because of fears that Chinamen were using it to seduce white women. You can pretty much go down the line with the drug and race paranoia, Mexicans and marijuana, African Americans and cocaine. So the war on drugs is important, but it's an incomplete explanation of the racial disparities. About 25% of people locked up in federal and state prisons are there for drug crimes. If tomorrow every person doing time for drugs got released, the United States would still have the largest prison system in the world. The other development was a get tough on crime movement that expanded criminal liability and greatly increased prison sentences. And now, this was in response to a dramatic increase in crime during the 1970s. So when I was a kid growing up in Chicago, a couple of memories seared in my consciousness because I was there when the crime went up. One is of this man running down the street in my working class segregated neighborhood, just waving a gun, and we were all cowering under cars. Another is my mom getting robbed at gunpoint outside of our house. And for the next year, she's afraid to go from the car to the house without a policeman watching her. So she has to flag down a cop, which at that time was hard to do. My mom had grown up in the same neighborhood in the 1950s, and it was completely different then. So nationally, homicides doubled between the early 60s and the early 70s. Robbery triples, and street crime actually goes up by a factor of 4. The people who commit these crimes and their victims are disproportionately African American. The black arrest rate for murder is about 7 times the white arrest rate. The arrest rate for robbery is 10 times higher. This probably more closely approximates the actual rate of offending than the drug arrests do. It doesn't necessarily follow, though, that the way to deal with this issue is to put the perpetrators in cages for years and then return them to the same communities, but that's the choice that was made. So if you look at federal and state prisons together, the majority of people are locked up for violent crimes. So in a formal legal sense, the main reason for race disparities in incarceration is that blacks commit a disproportionate share of the kinds of crimes that people go to prison for a long time for. Now, it's not obvious to some people that mass incarceration and race disparities are problems. Remember what I said about it being hard for my mom to flag down a cop car in the 1970s in my all-black neighborhood in Chicago. For most of American history, many criminal laws were actually under-enforced in African American communities. Now, blacks who were victimized by other blacks had a hard time attracting the interest of police and prosecutors. Now, in that same neighborhood in Chicago, the police are everywhere. For some people, that's a sign of progress. In their view, law enforcement is a public good. For a group to complain about having too much of it will be like complaining that they have too many schools or too many parks. For African Americans, they say the principal injury is under-enforcement of the law, not over-enforcement. So the special attention that we get now, the race disparities, are actually a form of reparations. Some of my African American police officer friends admit that they enforce the laws more strictly in minority communities, but they say it's because that's the community that they care about the most. So in a moment, I'll end by talking about the moral imperative to construct mass incarceration and racial disparities as a problem, but there are utilitarian reasons as well. Young black men are the most incarcerated group in the history of the world. If you're a black male high school dropout, you're more likely to be in prison than you are to have a job. The extraordinary rate of incarceration in the black community has devastating collateral consequences. So we've seen that communities can be destroyed by crime and by punishment. A lot of people, especially women and children, are doing time on the outside. And when an inmate gets out, and about 90% get out, they can't get a job. They can't get a student loan. They can't live in public housing. In Florida, until recently, they couldn't vote. In Ohio, they couldn't even get a license to be a barber. So the dope boys on the corner, they're hiring. So about 2/3 of the people who get out end up getting locked up again. A criminal caste is created. And when they do get out, they don't move to Cambridge or Georgetown or West Hollywood. They move right back to the hood. And their experience of being incarcerated has made them more dangerous, not less dangerous. One other utilitarian reason to think about mass incarceration and race disparities as a problem. One reason that the guy is more dangerous is because the law is less legitimate. Statistically, a black boy who's born in the 1990s will be arrested. That's going to be a fact of life for him. It's a rite of passage. The hip-hop slang for getting prosecuted is called catching a case. It connotes the same combination of responsibility and coincidence as catching the flu. It's a little bit your fault, a little bit stuff happens. That's a scary thing for public safety when a big group of people start feeling that way. What it means is that the law has lost its deterrent effect. For young black men in places like Roxbury and Harlem, the criminal justice system is the government. It's the primary manifestation of the state in their lives. Let's say that you live in Brownsville, a community in Brooklyn. You get jumped by the police about 5 times a year when they do stop and frisk. You frigging hate the police. That means that you hate the government. It's obviously not in anyone's best interest to develop a class of citizens with this kind of antipathy for the state. So I'll close with the moral argument why we ought to be concerned. Black people don't disproportionately commit some crimes because they're black. They do it because of environmental conditions like entrenched housing segregation, massive unemployment, lack of access to health care, broken down schools, and especially poverty. As Professor Bobo has pointed out, there's not one city in this entire country where we can say that blacks are equal to whites when it comes to basic economic indicators. In fact, the only socioeconomic factors that have the same kind of vast race disparities as incarceration have to do with wealth. White families are about 6 times wealthier than African American families. Until we close those gaps, we can expect that the race disparities in incarceration will be maintained. And so, since I study law, I'll close by thinking about the law's relationship to race disparities in criminal justice. Are they a problem that the law can resolve, or are they an example of what the law is supposed to do? Another way of asking that question is the law more like the opinion of the district judge in New York who outlawed the NYPD's practice of stop and frisk, or is the law more like the appellate court in New York that says that for at least for now, the police can keep on doing what they've been doing? So the law has remedied some injustices in race and crime. The NAACP actually started as a response to lynching, which was a form of racialized terrorism against African Americans. Lynching in that form is no longer a major problem. The law has eradicated some of the formal discrimination against blacks. African Americans are, in fact, important actors in the criminal justice system as prosecutors like me, police, judges, and lawmakers. But it's also true that traditional civil rights discourse, the law's normal tool for remedying racial injustice, doesn't work especially well in the criminal context. For discrimination, you have to prove an evil intent. That's tough to do. It may not even exist with regard to modern criminal laws. Moreover, rights can be overwhelmed by political or social development. So Gideon, that's the famous case, 50 years old, you have a right to a lawyer. If you can't afford one, the government will pay for one for you. You'd be better off being tried as a black man without a lawyer in 1962 than you would be as a black man with a lawyer in 2013 if you don't want to go to jail. The foundational civil rights text, the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery, specifically exempts punishment. So that's one of the claims made by people who use this startling statistic that there are actually more African Americans under criminal justice supervision today than there were slaves in 1850. So they think that the law is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's a form of social control of black people that has evolved from slavery to legal segregation to what's famously described as the new Jim Crow. And we can imagine a range of responses to the kinds of conditions that make people at risk for being incarcerated. It's far from intuitive that we should respond by putting folks in cages for many years. How much of our response is determined by by anti-black prejudice or white supremacy. There's some smoking gun evidence from President Nixon when he started the Tough on Crime movement. He says, you have to face the fact that the whole problem is the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes it while not appearing to. And shortly thereafter, we embarked on the largest expansion of a prison population in the history of the free world. So if our criminal justice system really is the new Jim Crow, what's going to be the new Brown versus Board of Education? When I started my opening statements saying that I represented the United States of America, what I meant is that we're doing this in your name. The question is, will you let us? Justice Clarence Thomas said that when he was a judge in D.C., he would look out the window and see all these young black men filing into criminal court in chains, and he would think, there, but for the grace of God, go I. President Obama speaking at the NAACP convention, same phrase, there, but for the grace of God, go I. My friends, the determination of who goes into criminal court in chains should not be so fortuitous. It should not depend so much on race and class. As long as it does, we need to treat this as a matter of grave importance for our democracy and for our sisters and brothers. And I'm grateful to the Mahindra Center for doing so.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Bernard Harcourt. Is Caleb next? Do we shuffle? All right, our next speaker, no, that's fine. Actually, Caleb can be next, and that's fine. Our next speaker is not Bernard Harcourt, even though he's sitting next. We messed that up. Caleb Smith is our next professor, and that's right, I set this order, and I messed up the cards. Professor Caleb Smith is a professor of English and American Studies at Yale University, and the author of 2 books about criminal justice and the American social imaginary. The Prison and the American Imagination, and The Oracle and the Curse. Great titles. I think you just tell from someone's titles what kind of speaker they're going to be. But I don't have to guess because I've heard Professor Smith speak before. He's a wonderful speaker, and I welcome him to the podium now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Carol, and thanks to all of you for being here and everybody who did the work to bring us together today. It's an honor to join this multidisciplinary conversation about the most urgent domestic crisis of our moment in American history. Mass incarceration invites resistance on every scale, from the most local and material practices of the living and the dying to the more theoretical and critical practices. Across a broad coalition of moral communities and within the academy, a wide range of disciplinary trainings and research specializations. I take it that my part here as a cultural historian and literary critic is to approach the question, how did we get here, in terms of a long history, one that extends not only through Attica and Soledad, but all the way back to the penitentiaries and plantations of the early American world. And my part is also to think about what goes on at the margins of a more and more self-enclosed penal system, to ask how this system links up with other domains of social and imaginative life, how, for instance, it seeks legitimacy or meets criticism in what Jürgen Habermas called the public sphere, or even more broadly, how the forms of knowledge and power that characterize our society make up what Michel Foucault called the conditions of acceptability of this system. Yet I also came here to raise some questions about how people like me in the critical humanities have approached these matters. As you may know, a crucial point of contact in the interdisciplinary field of law and humanities has been language, especially narrative language or storytelling. And the central concept that the critical humanities have brought to bear against legal institutions, when we've tried to do so, has been the concept of justice, the normative grounds of law. But today I really want to think about images of space rather than narratives of justice or injustice. And I want to pose the question of imprisonment without justice. What would it mean to speak of imprisonment without justice? There's two possibilities that come quickly to mind. First, obviously, the phrase might refer to the imprisonment of a wrongfully convicted defendant. So the incarceration of the innocent, almost everyone would agree, is a kind of imprisonment without justice. Second, imprisonment without justice might refer to a sentence that's technically valid according to the letter of the law, but contrary to some moral standard of fairness or right. Think of what Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail 50 years ago. One has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. In the half-century since then, many inmates in U.S. institutions have protested their incarceration by identifying themselves as political prisoners, living martyrs to a corrupt and racist and imperialist state. In a poem called How We Carry Ourselves, Jimmy Santiago Baca, writing from an Arizona penitentiary, glimpses a third prospect, and the one I want to talk about for the rest of my remarks today. Baca observes inmates' bodies, his own among them, mauled and incorporated into the machinery of the prison. We are steel hunks of gears and frayed ropes. Our hands the tool sheds, our heads the incessant groan of never-ending revolving wheels, and an empty, gaunt warehouse. Our blood dripping from steel joints like grease and oil onto granite floors. The prison as a warehouse, not a scene for an injured sovereign's ritualized vengeance against the body of the offender, not an apparatus for the reformation of the unruly soul, but a space of deathly inertia or of mere containment. There is some violence in this warehouse, but it's neither retribution nor a discipline of rehabilitation. It's an interminable wasting away. And here, imprisonment without justice might mean something other than unjust imprisonment. It might refer instead to a regime of mass incarceration that makes no claim to justice at all. Baca did his time in the 1970s when the U.S. was just developing its distinctive penal regime, and he was talking about a bizarre novelty. From its beginnings in the late 18th century, through the riots and struggles of the 1970s perhaps, the penitentiary system in the United States was mainly understood as a concrete manifestation of some theory of justice, either rehabilitative or retributive. At first, in the 19th century, the penitentiary was associated with a humanitarian reform movement that defined the cell as a scene of rehabilitation and redemption. And you can see something like that image of what a penitentiary was supposed to be here in this image from Eastern State in Philadelphia. The ministers and officials who oversaw these prisons routinely defined them against the public tortures and tomb-like dungeons of a despotic past. Many drew a contrast against the dehumanizing violence of Southern slave discipline in their own time, a distinction which obviously had to be reconsidered after emancipation and the Civil War amendments, when convict leasing put black labor back in chains, and the state-run prison farms came to occupy the grounds of the antebellum plantations. As everyone knows, the promise of compassion and rehabilitation was often betrayed by realities of wounding and killing. There's an image from New York's Auburn prison at about the same time. And the prison, no less than the gallows, can be understood as a scene of vengeful punishment. But in the liberal vision that animated much American statecraft, at least from the New Deal through the early 1960s, the prison system was most commonly imagined in terms of correction. Since then, over the past 50 years or so, the United States has built the largest prison system in the world, inhuman not only in its violence, but also in its scale, a system that we almost inevitably try to talk about by looking at the kinds of numbers that we've been looking at so far today. How did we get here? At one level, the transformation was provoked from within the prisons as widely publicized riots and resistance brought the existing system into crisis and authorities responded with a reactionary crackdown. More broadly, there was the social and economic instability of deindustrialization, the backlash against the radicalizing civil rights and anti-war movements, and a political turn to the right that culminated in the Reagan presidency and the triumph of a neoliberal consensus. But what is this vast machinery of dispossession? Where does it find its conditions of legitimacy, or even of its acceptability? Does it have anything to do anymore with any concept of justice? In 1981, the legal scholar Francis Allen came to my home institution, Yale University, and announced the decline of the rehabilitative ideal. In the propaganda of harsh justice, offenders were not depicted anymore as lost souls to be reclaimed. They were stigmatized as enemies of society to be captured, humiliated, and broken down. And in 2003, James Q. Whitman's Harsh Justice confirmed some of Francis Allen's dark prophecies, arguing that American criminal justice rests on an ideology of punitive degradation. So perhaps mass incarceration today legitimates itself in the public sphere by conjuring up old-fashioned nightmares of crime. Perhaps this system disseminates its ideology in culture by stoking old-fashioned fantasies of vengeance. Even the most casual observer can see it happening. Right-wing pundits ranting against dangerous predators, celebrity sheriffs inviting decent citizens to laugh at the humiliation of their inmates, an endless spectacle of monstrous criminals and hero crime fighters, all of it more or less explicitly organized along the lines of race and class. Strange to say, there's something almost comforting about this picture. I don't mean only that its familiar moral categories, racial categories, soothe the anxieties or excite the fantasies of an uncritical mass public. I mean that some of our critical analyses themselves come around to oddly reassuring conclusions. This terrible novelty, the largest, most expensive, and harshest prison system in the history of the world, is explained as the latest manifestation of old flaws in the American character. For 2 centuries, so the story goes, the pendulum of justice has been swinging back and forth between 2 models, rehabilitation and retribution. It's swung back for now to the side of retribution, but the tradition of liberal critique knows how to respond with humanizing stories, calls for mercy and understanding, efforts to restore the project of reform. Meanwhile, though, an alternative account has begun to emerge. In The New Penology in 1992, Malcolm Feely and Jonathan Simon famously made this point with perfect clarity. Quote, "The new penology is neither about punishing nor about rehabilitating individuals. It is about identifying and managing unruly groups." End quote. The traditional justice system had concerned itself with the individual offender, with determining fault and imposing an appropriate penalty. Rehabilitation meant assessing the character and attempting to transform it. And even retributive punishment took as its target the guilty subject, the one who deserved to suffer. The new penology left those ways of thinking behind. It shifted its focus away from the particular offender toward target populations, away from guilt toward security, away from the execution of a just sentence, toward the smooth functioning of its own institutional machinery, of the system itself. According to Feely and Simon, penology in the late 20th century was closing itself off from the rest of the world. It was becoming a self-regulating, self-contained system, less and less concerned with the norms that it might draw from such external spheres as law, politics, or popular culture. Although the same era had witnessed the tough-on-crime rhetoric of right-leaning politicians, disenchanted with the notion of rehabilitation, for instance, such macho talk disclosed little about penology's own logic. No single master narrative for the system could be identified, they suggested. Indeed, it's not clear that the prison system massive and self-reproducing as it has become, really requires legitimacy in the form of active public assent. Yet I would not quite wish to concede, as Feely and Simon seem to, that there's no longer any substantive relationship between the prison system and the rest of our social world. Rather, I would like to explore another possibility, that the policies and police strategies contributing to mass incarceration exploit a generalized fantasy of secure and sanitary public space. The ideology of the penal state may not be composed entirely of moral narratives about transgression and penitence, then. It may also include certain modes of picturing and enjoying the built environment. What calls the warehouses of abjection into being as a necessary and largely invisible infrastructure might be the spatial imaginary of our time. Insight into this problem comes, perhaps surprisingly, not from the critical humanities, but especially, it seems to me, from some work in the social sciences. So, for instance, the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore, interested in mapping the movement of people and resources, has shown how mass incarceration in California took underemployed people, especially young men of color, out of the urban centers, promising to clean up and secure the streets of the decaying cities by removing this troublesome population. It made people disappear. At the same time, it brought state investment and the hope of high-paying and secure jobs to rural zones whose mostly white populations had sagged into poverty. The project was to mobilize capital toward the restructuring of social space on a massive scale. Gilmore emphasizes that California's prison system has discarded most of the conventional justifications for punishment, the reformist ideal of rehabilitation, but also the vengeful fantasy of retribution, and the mission of governance through fear, which is known as deterrence. In California, as elsewhere, the logic of incarceration has been stripped down to its simplest form, incapacitation. From one point of view, then, mass incarceration by way of incapacitation is not really a theory of punishment at all. It's a warehousing. It's a policy for the management of social instability and social space. It does not require a vengeful memory. Its signature affects are insecurity or fear. Focusing on New York, the sociologist Loic Wacant has made a similar argument about space by bringing a critique of neoliberal statecraft to bear on the Giuliani administration's broken windows policy. Wacant writes, "The enemy is the subproletariat that mars the scenery and menaces or annoys the consumers of urban space." A crucial insight here is that the penal state is operative in sites where we might not be accustomed to looking for it. Its influence is felt not only within the prison interior, but also in cities which seem to have been emptied of their troublesome poverty and transformed into smooth, clean zones for consumption. The public perhaps assents to mass incarceration not only in the obvious way, by rallying like a lynch mob to the side of tough-on-crime politicians, but also by its eager participation in the securitization of public space. Gilmore and Wacant acknowledge the fear-mongering and about subhuman criminals and the narratives of a merciless justice that play out as an interminable media spectacle these days. Yet the total picture that emerges from their work is one of a system whose real business is the management of territory and population on a large scale. The problem to be addressed by the new penology is not the criminal violation of the social compact, it is economic and social instability. And the fantasy to be peddled is not so much one of vengeance against the terrible few as one of greater stability for the rest of us, in particular the fantasy of urban space as a smooth, clean zone for circulation and enjoyment. Perhaps then the system of mass incarceration legitimates itself today by appealing not only to a vengeful imagination, but also more subtly to an insecure one. Here we can trace a turn from the moral economy of justice to the material economies of capital and power, We can track a waning interest in the mentality or character of any particular offender and a greater focus on the designation of target populations, often in terms of race or class. And as many of you no doubt know, Michelle Alexander in the New Jim Crow has demonstrated how mass incarceration reconstructs the infrastructure of racial segregation. And we can see the movement away from narratives of transgression toward a picture-based imaginary that conceives of social space as either secure or insecure, either contaminated by troublesome poverty or polished clean for smooth circulation. What prospects then remain open to critique? One task for scholars, I think, would be to understand how the ongoing urban crisis of the neoliberal era from the late 1970s up to the very recent past came to be seen most of all as a problem of crime, a condition of insecurity in public space, to be addressed by police and prisons. To grasp how governments and publics came to think about crime less as a transgression against divine law or the social contract and to be met with just punishment, less as an effect of poverty to be managed by the welfare state, and more as a disturbance in the landscape, especially the cityscape. To ask, in other words, how the concept of crime was expanded so that institutions originally designed for criminal justice could serve the much broader program of spatial reorganization. This kind of inquiry would seek to excavate ways of thinking about social space which are hardly present to consciousness. To be clear, I'm not arguing that the prison system is not propped up now and then by the propaganda of harsh justice. But what I am suggesting is that the prison system may no longer need to legitimate itself by appeal to either vengeance or rehabilitation, that it no longer depends on any theory of justice at all. In a profound sense, the prison is not an instrument of punishment anymore. It is a warehouse, as Jimmy Santiago Baca says. If you want to see how mass incarceration works its way into the social imaginary, how it takes hold in such a fundamental way that there hardly seems to be any alternative, we therefore may need to not only to analyze the speeches of tough-on-crime politicians, the rants of right-wing pundits, or the sensational representations of crime and vengeance in the latest blockbuster. The insecure imagination is to be discovered instead in the background, in every nightmare of broken windows, in every fantasy of secure communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is now Bernard Harcourt, who is the Julius Krieger Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of Chicago, and has also just been elected Directeur d'études at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, where he will be going tomorrow. So we're very lucky to have him today with us. He is the author of a number of books about crime and punishment. Perhaps the one I'd mention in this context is his first book, Illusion of Order, The False Promise of Broken Windows Policing, published by Harvard University Press in 2001, which echoes some of the themes that Professor Smith just elaborated for us today. So there's some dovetailing there in interest. Professor Harcourt.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Homi Baba, for bringing us together. Mass incarceration must be understood simultaneously as a unique phenomenon, uniquely dehumanizing, the product of a unique set of political and social circumstances in the United States over the last 40 years, but also, at the same time, as another episode of mass injustice in this country. To understand it properly, it must be placed both within the realm of the exceptional and in the domain of the repetitive. It is exceptional in its specific manifestation and antecedents. The racial discrimination is staggering. A cumulative, consistent, continual racial disproportionality over the full course of the 20th century. The extremes of overcrowding, on the one hand, and on the other, the extreme of solitary confinement. The inhuman conditions of those suffering from mental illness, of the suicide watch cell, of the acute suicide watch cell, of the human cage to await psychiatric treatment, of the therapy session, of the group therapy session. The conditions in which we put our fellow human beings today are simply uniquely inhuman. It is also unique in terms of its antecedents. A new study in the American Journal of Sociology by Michael Campbell and Heather Schoenfeld meticulously dissects the micro and macro level interactions between political initiatives, sentencing reforms, and special interest lobbying that occurred at the intersection of the political and penal fields to produce 3 periods corresponding to our new penal order. First, destabilization through 1975. Second, the contestation of high crime politics through 1992. And then solidification of the new penal order well into the 21st century. At the same time, it is vitally important to step back and place mass incarceration within the larger arc of recurring forms of excessive punishment in this country. To understand that these specific forms, 3-strike laws, mandatory arrest policies, police profiling, fit within a larger framework of governance of views about the proper role of the state. The recurrence must be interrogated in relationship to the peculiar institutions of slavery, Jim Crow, and the ghetto, as Loïc Wacon and Michel Alexander have shown, to our history of lynching, but also more recently to the massive institutionalization of mental patients in asylums in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, as well as the mass internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. These phenomena can't properly be understood separately. We need to take a dual perspective, somewhat like a pair of bifocal glasses that can help us see both afar but read up close, to help us focus both on the longue durée and on the unique present, in order to explore not only the micro-political forces that push towards mass incarceration, but also what prevented us this time, as well as past times, to resist more effectively. It is crucial to look back in order to look inward. Inward to search within ourselves, to explore why we did not resist more, or better, the crack sentencing or the Rockefeller laws. Why so many of our policies were implemented by liberals, by Democrats. What is it about security and policing that insulates them from our critical, liberal, or progressive values? How could it be that in this country that prides itself on liberty, this, the most liberal, advanced, the most stable democracy, the one that rightly boasts an unparalleled economic freedom, that we would hold the world record in the number of citizens incarcerated in jails and prisons? How did we let this happen? The question is not just rhetorical. I believe there is actually a perverse connection, which is directly tied to what can be called the illusion of free markets or the paradox of neoliberal penality. In this country, the recent cycle of excessive punishment has been made possible. It has been made tolerable, in large part because of our paradoxical belief in the incompetence of government in economic and social affairs, coupled with our strange belief in, and strange faith in the state when it comes to security, policing, and punishing. Let me explore this issue by focusing on 3 moments. First, the immediately prior period of mass institutionalization. Second, the American political economy of mass incarceration. And third, the moralization necessary for us to tolerate these human conditions. First, the rate at which this country institutionalized people in asylums in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s was staggering and somehow hidden from our view, practically so until today. It took place in all kinds of facilities, institutions for mental defectives, for epileptics, public and private institutions for the mentally retarded, psychopathic hospitals, psychiatric wards at VA hospitals, state, county, and city hospitals, public and private hospitals for the mentally ill. The conditions in many of these institutions were appalling. Frederick Wiseman's 1967 documentary, Titicut Follies, would expose those practices and, of course, would be censored. but eventually we began to see inside. Here, too, the phenomenon was unique, very different demographically. In the 1960s, about half of the institutionalized populations were women, whereas throughout the 20th century, about 95%, increasingly female though, of incarcerated persons were men. The mental hospital populations were far more white and older. By 1923, for instance, 92.2% of asylum patients were white and only 7.6% were African Americans, in sharp contrast to prisons today, which are over 40% African American and Hispanic. And it occurred during a very different time of welfarism, of provident government, of 5-year plans, mostly as a result of World War II and centralized planning and New Deal responses to the Depression. It represented a different form of excessive punishment, shaped by distinct sets of ideas: faith in the state as protector, a rehabilitative model associated with the welfare state. As Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward show in their classic book, Regulating the Poor, the rise of welfarism and the gradual return to prudentialism represented at its worst a distinct kind of punitiveness. What we would witness across the states was a massive buildup of asylums and mental patients, disproportionately targeting marginal women and, in many southern states, African Americans. Its demise took the form of massive deinstitutionalization, which, with all its problems of trans-institutionalization and racial discrimination, and the collapse of welfarism, may nonetheless offer some lessons for us today. And it's interesting to note that while I'm focusing on the American case, and Nikki Lacey shortly will be placing this case within a more comparative approach, many European countries relied far more historically on mental hospitalization than on incarceration, and they too have been following with a lag our trend regarding the displacement of mental hospitalization. Second, the turn to law and order during the turmoil of the 1960s and the backlash against the civil rights movement fit within a larger neoliberal paradigm of faith in deregulated markets, accompanied by theories of human capital that would result in the radical disinvestment in certain minority populations and reinvestment in other communities, especially middle-class prison labor. An entirely different set of beliefs about the state, about governing, would mark the shift from the asylum to the prison. It involved a resurgence of economic liberalism, and with it the paradoxical idea that government is incompetent when it comes to economics, but has only one function, and that is policing and punishing. I would argue that there is a historical link between the two that can be traced back to the 18th century, analyzing first the diachronic evolution of two historical ideas, that of the free market on the one hand, and how it developed from notions of natural orderliness from the 19th century physiocrats onwards, that's the left column, and that of a police state on the other hand, the right column. And second, the synchronic linkages at each of the historical stages of these two necessarily imbricated notions. Today, the notion of freedom of markets and deregulations is inextricably linked to trust in our government to provide homeland security. There is a symbiotic relationship between free, efficient, competitive markets and the penal state. And this is reflected well in my colleague Richard Posner's argument that the major function of criminal law in a capitalist society is to prevent people from bypassing the market because it is efficient. This paradoxical juxtaposition of economic liberalism and the Leviathan police state has facilitated punitive excess, and not just in the past 40 years during the period of neoliberalism, but also during the early 19th century, at the birth of the penitentiary in the Jacksonian era, during a period historians now call the market revolution. The vast majority of people in this country believe that the state is basically incompetent at managing an economy and cannot be trusted with much except policing. Over 70% of respondents in the United States agree that the free enterprise system and free market economy is the best system on which to base the future of the world. We have bought into the liberal economic ideas of the late 18th century, renewed and made scientific in the 20th century with ideas of market efficiency and equilibriums and Pareto optimality. We need to analyze this larger arc of the American political economy of punishment. Notions of human capital are especially important here. American neoliberalism American neoliberal thought has facilitated a politics at home that treats people as human capital, some of whom are worth the investment and others not. It has given way to governmental policies that differentiate between high return and low return investments. On the one hand, hyper-incarceration reflects a complete disinvestment in the young African American and Hispanic men who make up the jail and prison population. There is no investment in their education, nor in their housing, nor in their family situation, nor in their health. Public housing in the United States is dilapidated and abandoned, left to ruin. Nowhere is this more evident than in Chicago. These are images of Stateway Garden in Chicago by the photographer Patricia Evans. How did we come to tolerate these conditions for these beautiful children? There is no safety net for the unemployed or those suffering from mental illness. Downtown Los Angeles is a tragic illustration, described accurately as a wretched area where thousands of destitute, mentally ill, and drug-dependent human beings sleep on the sidewalks, pitch tents, make shelters, and encampments out of discarded and cardboard boxes, urinate and defecate in the street, wander about, trolling shopping carts, overflowing with all their earthly possessions. How do we tolerate this? What makes this acceptable to us? On the other hand, there is a significant investment in the communities that welcome and derive financial returns from prisons and jails. The states invest approximately $47 billion per year in this economy, including wages for the guard labor, that then invest in their families and the service industries that cater to the prisons. These investments create microeconomies that depend entirely on the prison, and as a result, the counties that are home to prisons resist ferociously when local and state governments threaten them with the closure of their capital investment, the prison. And sadly, there is evidence that this investment strategy succeeds, or at least helps validate the American neoliberal theory of economic prosperity. As Bruce Western works shows, the economic growth of the 1990s is a fiction only made possible by excluding from our calculations everyone in prison. The idea of economic improvement, especially for African Americans during the 1990s, depended on prison growth. It was an artifact of exclusion. While we use the close-up part of our bifocals to isolate the individual variables that produce 3 strikes and mandatory minimum laws, we also need to account from afar for what makes LA's Skid Row tolerable. How come we didn't resist, or did not resist sufficiently, the rotting away and destruction of public housing? The tolerability of all this needs to be explained. Now, as you know, rates of incarceration in the US have begun to subside. Here, for instance, is the trend in New York State. By my analysis, though, this is an effect of budgetary constraints and sharply reduced crime rates in New York and across the country, not a fundamental shift in our views on the state and security. Third, the period of mass incarceration was also accompanied by a moralization of the inner city through the war on drugs, conservative law and order politics, and a turn to incapacitation. The demonization of Black and Hispanic young men cannot be quantified, in contrast, say, to crime rates, but it has contributed importantly to our inability to resist the tidal wave that hit the United States starting in the 1970s. It is important for us to explore the mechanisms and devices by which ideas become pervasive and held as truths. One vital dimension is precisely moral economies. Here we need to turn or return both to the work of E.P. Thompson, whose writings on the moral economy of the English crowd would allow us to rethink seemingly spontaneous and spasmodic food riots as fully coherent moral resistance to new forms of economic relations, as well as to the Nietzschean Weber, the Weber of the Protestant ethic. Weber's genealogy of the new spirit of capitalism passed directly through ethics. It is only through both the moralization of human capital and the demonization of minority populations that we would be able to convince a population, to convince ourselves, to accept these conditions. There has been a moral struggle, an ethical battle, as Foucault would argue in his prescient 1973 lectures on the punitive society, a civil war, as he called it, that has produced the notion of the criminal as social enemy. If you listen carefully, you will hear it all around you. I have often been struck, for instance, by, again, my colleague Richard Posner's discussion of the moral rightness of hating criminals, of the idea that the hatred of the criminal serves a moral role insofar as it contributes to the utilitarian calculus necessary for an effective criminal justice system, or his statements about the legal representation of indigent defendants. A bare-bones system for the defense of indigent criminal defendants may be optimal. The moralization of criminality and of criminals has a long history in this country. One need only refer back to Professor John Giulio's early interventions in the 1990s, when he developed a theory of super-predator youths, what he called the new generation of street criminals who are upon us. In Bennett, DiLulio, and Walter's 1996 book, Body Count, they would write of the youngest, biggest, and baddest generation any society has ever known. Based on all that we have witnessed, researched, and heard from people who are close to the action, here is what we believe. America is now home to thickening ranks of juvenile super-predators, radically impulsive, brutally remorseless youngsters, including even more teenage boys who murder, assault, rape, rob, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, join gun-toting gangs, and create serious communal disorders. If you go back further and reread Nixon's stump speeches, you will see how the inner city is deeply demonized, racialized in its coded way. You can see how he associates poverty and the cities with violence and failure, right? Arguing against what he would say, billions for government jobs, government housing, government welfare. Of course, the neoliberal paradox here should be evident, right? What we did see was billions for government jobs, guard labor, government housing, the prison, and government welfare. Northern counties receiving prisons. These are the moralizations, the demonizations that make us swallow neoliberal penalty, that blind us to the paradox of economic liberty and mass incarceration. In the end, to understand where we are today, to understand how we got here, we need to marry the American political economy of punishment to an American genealogy of morals. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker before we will open up to a broader conversation is Professor Nicola Lacey, who is the school professor of law, gender, and social policy at the London School of Economics. She before was at All Souls College at Oxford, and her research on criminal law and criminal justice has broadened to a particular, or it's narrowed, if you will, has included a particular focus on comparative and historical scholarship, and she will add a historicizing comparative dimension of the United States in the world for us now. Thank you, Professor Lacey.
Thank you, Carol. Well, can I just echo the other speakers in thanking Homi, Carol, and Shannon for this wonderful invitation to discuss this important topic. And I have, of course, the particular pleasure and privilege of following not one act that's difficult to follow, but 4 acts which are difficult to follow. I'd like to just preface what I have to say with a bit of an apology in a way, because I'm actually going to speak mainly about the comparative dimension of our thinking about imprisonment in this country. And as such, I'm going to be talking quite a lot about the social sciences rather than the humanities. So I do just want to start by celebrating that this event should be happening in this humanities centre, and acknowledging the extraordinary contribution which the humanities have to so many different aspects of how we think about and cultivate our awareness of imprisonment, from philosophical investigations of alternative ways of thinking about punishment, to historical analysis and genealogical analyses of how we got where we are, through, of course, to literary and visual evocations of the psychological, the emotional reality of imprisonment. And I'm so glad, Homi, that you started with that searing vision of the prison system from Oscar Wilde's Ballad of Reading Gaol, I would just like to lob in another of my favourites, which rather speaks to some of the images that Bernard was showing, which is Mary Wollstonecraft's one novel evokes the experience of women's imprisonment in the most extraordinary way. And I think I was thinking as I was listening to you, Homi, funnily enough, just be anecdotal for a moment, I've spent the last 3 years of my life doing quite a lot of commuting between London and Oxford, and you can see Reading Gaol from the train. It's right in the middle of the city. It's an absolutely classic instance of a sort of 19th century jail, which is to say it looks like a prison. In fact, it looks like a sort of minor castle built in rather bad taste. It's right there in the middle of the city. And I was just reflecting as I listened to you, and particularly as the arguments developed from my colleagues, I was thinking about the change in the iconography of the prison and what that means, because it seems to me that what we're talking about today, in part, is a certain kind of failure of collective imagination, or a sort of desensitization, or even perhaps a kind of repression of this extraordinary scale of a social practice going on all around us, which has hugely increased in scale and intensity, and yet which is so often relatively invisible. And for that reason, I'm particularly glad to be talking about the comparative perspective on this, because my experience over the last few years of talking to American audiences about the comparative data on imprisonment suggests to me that even really very well-educated and broad-minded people are shocked when they understand just how unique the prison system is in this country today. So I'm going to start just by, and I should say that I think that the point of comparative, looking at the comparative figure, is not just to, therefore, to try and understand how we got where we got to in this country today, but also to remind ourselves that things can be, and indeed are in many countries otherwise. That's not to say that it's easy to change from here to there, but it's terribly important not to resist this sort of normalization of mass imprisonment. So let me just start by showing you, this really goes back to the charts that Carol was showing right at the beginning, but just to give a little bit more comparative texture, and I want you to just compare these two charts for a moment. So that one gives the United States with a group of other countries, including my country, England and Wales, then a group of Nordic countries, Germany, the Netherlands. And if you look at that, going back to 1950, you see in greater comparative perspective, really the message that Carol was giving you at the beginning. But the interesting thing is that if you look at it like that, it really looks as though the USA is on its own and all the other countries are very, very similar. But if I show you, in fact, the same chart, but one in which I nipped this country off in its prime, as it were, you'll see that there are actually tremendously significant differences in the patterns of imprisonment in other countries, differences which are just sort of pushed into oblivion in a way by the extraordinary scale of imprisonment and the growth of imprisonment in this country over the last 40 or so years. So I want us to just hold that sort of basic picture within our heads as I suggest a few arguments about why this country has got to where it is. Now, I should say that many of the most important factors, in my view, have already been mentioned. Clearly, the history and politics of race in this country, the war on drugs and other criminal justice phenomena like mandatory sentencing have played a part, the demise of the rehabilitative ideal, the demise perhaps more generally of a certain commitment to welfarism. But the issue that I'd like to put before you really, or to add to this discussion, is that of the broader social and institutional conditions which produce these policy decisions and outcomes, many of them, as Bernard has reminded us, made by self-proclaimed liberals and Democrat governments. Now, there are two very, very large and unmanageable things that haven't been mentioned much so far, although they've been alluded to, but I just want to put them explicitly on the table. And that is, first of all, what happened to the American economy from the 1970s, really what happened with the decline of the industrial sector, the collapse of low and semi-skilled jobs in manufacturing, the collapse of Fordism, in other words, which I think produced outcomes, particularly in urban areas, that did, I think, shape the course that the prison system took. But that, of course, is not a sufficient explanation, because England and Wales had a similarly drastic collapse of its manufacturing industrial sector. So I don't think we can completely pin everything on that, but I do think that it was a factor for reasons that I will come back to. But the other, and I think that the one of the reasons it was so important was that it put a new spin to something that is already a very complicated thing to do in this country, which is the building of political coalitions to underpin redistribution and pro-welfare policies. And there is a tremendous amount of evidence from research, including research by Bruce Weston, who's here, that there is a huge association between the level of welfare spending, both in states in this country and the imprisonment rate, and that finding is replicated internationally for many different countries. There's a study that looks at the whole OECD. But the second factor, which I'll linger on a little bit longer, is the question of whether there are things about the way your political system works that might have made it more possible for these sorts of perverse, immoral, counterproductive, costly policies to have found such a decisive footing as compared with other similar countries on this chart. So I'm just going to skip over and show you a little chart. The point I want to suggest to you is that one of the things that has allowed for this race towards mass imprisonment has to do with the very decentralized and fragmented political system in this country. And in particular, for the way in which electoral politics are diffused not only into not just states but localities, but also in relation to roles which are actually within the criminal justice system, like judges or some prosecutors, or which are very close to the delivery of criminal justice. Now, here I've got just a very simple chart which compares this country with three rather similar countries. So why do I say they're similar? Well, they are what are known as liberal market economies. They have sort of relatively short-term economic relations. They all also have relatively high, as opposed to Northern European or Nordic countries, levels of guard labour, according to the work of the economist Sam Bowles. They have all moved further towards a sort of workfare type welfare system. And they've all got very adversarial, first-past-the-post type majoritarian political systems. So for a whole number of reasons, they seem like an obvious group of comparators. You've already seen that the outcomes in terms of the imprisonment rate are very different. So what this chart shows is where decisions are made. And you can see immediately that in a whole number of areas highly relevant to criminal justice, policing, prosecution decisions, and adjudication of criminal cases, you see far more diffusion of power, decentralization in this country than you do in any of these other liberal market countries. And that also applies to the way in which education policy and residential zoning policy works in this country. And I'll come back to why that might be important. But first, let me just suggest to you three reasons why it might be the case that having a very decentralized political system under the sorts of conditions that were produced by the economic situation from the 1970s on and by the history and politics of race might have had some fairly dramatic and distinctive effects. The first point has to do really with the diffusion of electoral competition. We know from research on many countries that under the sorts of conditions that have persisted over the last 30 or 40 years, there has been a danger, particularly in majoritarian, two-party dominated political systems, that once the, as it were, relatively left or centre party gets on the tough on crime, tough on law and order bandwagon, you tend to get a kind of arms race between the two parties as to who can be tougher on crime. And that is very hard for either party then to roll back from, to step back from, because of the electoral costs of doing so. It's what I call, in a very tendentious and quite naughty sort of reference to game theory, because it's not genuinely a prisoner's dilemma, but it is a kind of prisoner's dilemma. You can't coordinate, the two parties find it hard to coordinate, to roll back this policy, even if they privately think it's counterproductive. Now, why should that make a difference here? Well, because you've got so many more elections. If it's true that this so-called prisoner's dilemma effect has led, in my country, to an acceleration of tough law and order policy, is likely to have had more impact here, because you've got so much electoral competition, so much closer to the delivery of criminal justice. You've got much less chance of keeping criminal justice in a somewhat cooler political rhetoric. And if you'd like some sort of very vivid literary anecdotal vision of that, I just recommend a wonderful book recommended to me by Chris Muller by Steve Bagheera called Courtroom 302, which has an extraordinary story about the impact of local media in the run-up to an election, in the run-up to judicial elections. Absolutely vivid. It's also worth saying that you might think, and there's certainly argument in the relevant literature, that, well, you know, this is great having all this electoral competition because it's all about accountability, electoral accountability right down in communities, responsiveness and so on. But the problem is that very often the people who win electorally out of promising to be tough are not the people who pay the electoral costs somewhere down the line of all the dysfunctional effects of mass imprisonment, which we've been hearing about. So that's the first reason to think that your diffuse and decentralized electoral system might have played a role in making you react yet more extremely to forces that already in the other liberal market countries did also lead to a significant rise in imprisonment. Here's a second reason, which is probably more controversial. I think it's important to reflect on, not least because some of the really enlightening commentators, including Bill Stuntz, have really made quite a case for a renewed localism. There is, I think, reason to be sceptical about whether devolving decisions down to localities is going to help in motivating welfarist or redistributive or more moderate policy making. If you look, for example, at the work that's been done on who turns out to vote in local elections as opposed to state elections or federal elections, you see two things. First of all, that fewer people vote on the whole in local elections, and secondly, that they're on average more privileged people. In other words, to put it very crudely, it pays you to get involved in local politics and go out and vote, it appears, if you have assets to protect. And there may be reason to think that people, so it's a different group of people who dominate local elections. It's not necessarily the people who are on the receiving end of mass imprisonment or saturation policing or whatever it might be. But it may be that they are voting on a smaller agenda of things that really relate to their own interest in their locality. They're voting for, you know, the peaceful city of consumption. They're voting for good schools in their area. They're voting for policing. They're voting for imprisonment. It's just putting it very crudely, but to set out the argument. And then the third point about a decentralized political system is really the mirror image of the second point, and that is that if you have that level of fragmentation of your policy making and delivery structure, there is a real converse difficulty in steering from the centre. So even if it's easier to build a political coalition from the centre, it's very, very difficult to deliver it. Now, you might say, well, that's ridiculous. We've been talking in these panels about the war on drugs. The war on drugs was a federal initiative. But I think if you really look at the amount of federal money that found its way to localities in the war on drugs, and you look at how the war on drugs had to be delivered, which was mainly at local level, you have to ask yourself whether actually the war on drugs was asking states and localities to do things that they didn't already see themselves as having reasons to do. So I think that this relative weakness of the federal government in this country, as opposed to the very much more centralised frame for policy making in all these other liberal market countries, has led to, for example, a greater reliance on litigation, on so-called adversarial legalism as a way of pushing through policy. And that is, I think, although sometimes effective, a very costly and in a very patchy kind of way of trying to deliver social policy. Now, I just want to make time for one more point, one more, slide. I'm going to go back. And that is to really suggest that we can't understand the patterns of these very distinctive, these unique patterns of imprisonment in this country solely in terms of the development of criminal justice policy. Criminal justice policy has mattered. The conditions under which that policy has been made matters. But I think that this chart I want to suggest to you suggests that there are much deeper things at work. So here we have just some very basic indicators. I've got the prison population per capita for the US, for this country, for the UK, for Australia, New Zealand and Canada. The homicide rate, you see, is much higher here. But then look at these other broader social indicators. The literacy score. This country doing significantly worse than the other liberal market countries. And then look at Sweden. It's just doing so much better. Child poverty, similarly, starkly bad outcome in this country. And then, let me sort of end on, because it really speaks to what Caleb was mentioning, residential segregation. Absolutely fantastic work is being done by geographers and demographers now on the spatial organisation of disadvantage. There's also fantastic work being done on the knock-on effects of concentrations of poverty, people like Ruth Peterson and Laurie Crevo. I would suggest that even just looking at this very simple, quite crude chart, it's not hard to see that that it's very plausible to think that the social dynamics which have produced mass imprisonment are also at work in producing these other outcomes, which, moreover, as we have heard, in many ways interact with and deepen the bad effects of mass imprisonment. Thank you very much.
Well, I promised you a great panel, and I think I feel vindicated, have delivered on that. We have 15 minutes left. I know that this panel, the five of us, could easily fill up this time. I've asked each of them to be prepared with questions for one another, and I see that they have them. But since we only have 15 minutes remaining, and you have been such a patient and attentive audience, I thought I would give you the floor to make your comments, ask your questions, and engage with this panel on the question. So if you don't mind, I will ask you to stand and speak loudly, and then I'm going to repeat your question because this event is being live streamed, and I don't... Oh, excellent. I won't even have to repeat your question. Yes, this woman here.
I've hardly formulated my question, but I'm struck by I've hardly formulated my question, but the rise of private prisons and the comparison between the Inquisition and what's going on in this country as far as how many people profit from the system, and their and the profit motive as a disincentive for change. Everybody's making money off of prisons. Verizon's making money off of it. Everybody's making money off of it, and you can incarcerate people. You can criminalize the least inoffensive behavior as being, urinating in public is a sex offense. There are so many things that they've criminalized that if you stop to think about it aren't really crimes. Low-level drug consumption also I would fit into that, but basically the who profits from the prison system is what basically I think of. Thank you.
I was going to say, I think this is closest to Bernard's presentation.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, what it raises in my mind are the enormous, the number of entities that do actually profit. And it's in ways that often we don't see when we're not involved with the criminal justice system. But for anyone who has a loved one who's in prison or a client who's in prison, the charges on Western Union money transfers are simply outrageous. The charges on telephones and the way in which telephone companies will pay, essentially, departments of corrections in order to get a contract, right, so that they can then charge extraordinarily exorbitant rates to the families who then are the ones who are charged when a loved one or someone calls. It's really remarkable. It completely goes under the radar screen, I think, in this country. But it's a piece of mass incarceration at a very fundamental level that kind of goes through the fiber. Private prisons represent a relatively small percent of total correctional in the correctional system. I think it's approximately 8%. Is that right, Marie? Approximately 8%. So it's not. When I think of the ways in which corporations are profiting, it is through those extraordinarily hidden devices that I think of. Yeah.
Any other comments, or should we take another question? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you. Thanks a lot. Can you hear me? No? Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. This panel was very, very interesting. I am a formerly incarcerated person from the federal system, and I go all over the place and I speak about the issue of mass incarceration. As a formerly incarcerated person, I'm always struck by how organized and calm forums such as this are, and how informative, but how absolutely chaotic and dysfunctional and destructive life within a prison and life around for the families of people who are incarcerated, of incarcerated people are. And I'm still not quite accustomed to that shift yet, from that chaos to something like discussing it in a forum like this. So thank you. One of the things that I didn't hear a lot about, but there were some brief references made to, was the increase in the incarceration rate of women in this country. And earlier today, I was at the State House at a gun violence hearing, and we talk about that issue as if it's in a silo. So it's very interesting. We organized using Professor Caleb Smith's, using Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book, The Golden Gulag. We organized within the federal prison system using that book. So it's very important that we think about the very destructive forces that mass incarceration has had, and that it has shredded the very fabric of black communities in this country and the impact that it has, particularly because the incarceration rate of African American women, mostly due to the war on drugs. I just left a prison full of 1,600 women. All of them, except me and a couple of others, were there for drug offenses and didn't need to spend another day being warehoused in that prison. And the separation and the destruction that has caused their families and communities, their children, is something that I hope people really take pause and start to inform yourselves about. And we have got to stop what's happening right now. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your intervention. We're very lucky to have you here today, and we appreciate your comments. Just in terms of people educating themselves about the impact of incarceration on women and on prisons, there's one book that I know sort of along the lines of Nikki Lacey's Invocation of Courtroom 302. There's a book by Nicola LeBlanc called Random Family, which tracks the lives of a South Bronx brother and sister over 10 years. Their lives in total, but includes stints in corrections institutions, particularly for the sister, through the war on drugs, and speaks a lot to the impact of that on her family. And okay, great.
It talks about a lot about women and the impact of incarceration, of mass incarceration in this country. It's Upper Bunkies Unite.
Upper Bunkies Unite.
Yes.
Upper Bunkies Unite. Excellent. A book too. Thank you very much.
Can I add to our book list?
A book list.
Book list?
Add to our book list. Yes. Reading list.
Megan Comfort also has an ethnography of the effects of prison and prisonification on the families of prisoners, and it's an ethnography of family visitation. That's pretty. That is also very good at kind of entering this world.
Yeah.
Over here, Professor Western.
I thought this was a really great panel. So Marie and I have been toiling away in this National Research Council panel for the last 18 months on the causes and consequences of high incarceration rates. And the hot button issue in our committee is the role of serious crime in the growth of incarceration rates. And in 1962, there were 8,500 murders in the country. By 1972, there were about 18,000 murders in the country. And murder rates continued to increase through 1980 or so. So, general question for the panel. What is the role of serious crime in this story about the emergence of mass incarceration?
Professor Lacey.
I'm glad you've raised that question. I was actually going to say something about it, but I ran out of time. Just from the comparative point of view, I mean, I must say that I know that many people think, well, look at the graphs. It's obvious that the rise wasn't caused by crime. You know, there's a lag. That I don't find that completely convincing, because I think it seems very plausible, first of all, that certain kinds of crime would have been had much more political impact and social impact than others, particularly serious violence. And secondly, it isn't, the mere fact that there's a lot of survey evidence that people aren't actually that worried about crime when you survey them doesn't seem to me to be convincing, because the issue is who are the people who the politicians are really bothered about, the people who swing elections, the median voters. So I'm inclined to think that serious violence, as much as homicide, was part of the picture and acquired a certain kind of political salience that helps to explain why some liberals were taking the line they did. It's a very unpopular position. It's also a hard one to run comparatively, because of course it's extremely difficult to to compare levels of serious violence across countries because of difference in crime definition. But actually, David and I have been doing some work on that just recently in relation to England and Wales in this country, and our estimates suggest that actually the disparity between levels of serious violent crime here, interpersonal violent crime, and here and in the state, in England and Wales, are very similar to those for homicide.
I want to say something perhaps even more unpopular in this audience, which is that the rising levels of violent crime that Professor Western has commented on had moved kind of the expert consensus away from the rehabilitative ideal that dominated earlier decades in the 20th century and toward, expert or some expert embrace of selective incapacitation strategies, which lie behind, for example, the very popular 3 strikes you're out initiatives that account for some significant amount of the huge jump up in mass incarceration. So expert consensus about what works and what doesn't work in response to rising violent crime rates that appeared sort of inexorably upward, I think played a role in bringing about some of the policy changes that we've seen.
Can I add something on this?
Yes.
Thanks. I think that it's important to distinguish between raw fact and the interpretation of facts, the way that facts are heard, used, received, the attention we give to them, etc. I've seen this clearly in the context of broken windows policing, where from 1993, as Rob Sampson's good work shows us in part also, to 1996, we saw, sharp drops in robbery in New York City, right? 60% is remarkable. It was considered a period of order in New York City. At the very same time, complaints of police misconduct went up 60%, right? That wasn't a fact that got the attention that the other fact did. And we interpreted the time as a period of orderliness in New York City. Well, it's up to us to decide whether it was a time of orderliness or disorderliness. The fact was police complaints went up 60% during that time. The question that I would ask in the context of high crime during the period of the late 60s and 70s, right, is what other indicators were going through the roof? I would want to look at what were the other issues of, say, poverty or health statistics or other facts that maybe didn't get interpreted or didn't get used or weren't talked about, that in some sense would also have been interpreted in a different way. And so I would be focusing on this period not as raw facts, but as how do they get used.
And finally, just to make the obvious point that there is a not necessarily direct line between a rise in crime and a rise in incarceration. Those are phenomena that might be connected, but that might not be. So part of the reason we took this punitive turn in the 80s, again, I want to suggest has to do a lot with race and with fear of the black male body. If we look at race disparities in homicide, for the early 1900s, they were lower than they are now. They're about 2 to 1. Now they're about 6 to 1 for the crime of murder. So again, something is going on, and some of the people in this room have done the best descriptions of what is going on, including, again, the decline of the welfare state, the movement of jobs, especially for working class people, out of cities. And again, there's I think we have to acknowledge that white supremacy, that anti-black prejudice plays a large role. Because again, the people who are most in favor of these harsh sentences are the same ones who exhibit the most racial prejudice. It doesn't mean that that's the only reason why someone might want a tough sentence for a murderer. But at the end of the day, I think it's more about a failure of imagination or being cowardly about imagining alternatives that would make us safer, rather than putting people in the kinds of cages that Bernard's images showed us.
Just one more point on this, just to tie together Nikki's comparative perspective and Paul's racial perspective, is that it's not inevitable that rising crime, even rising serious violent crime, would result in rising incarceration. Just to use as a contrast or a foil the experience of Finland, which was on Nikki Lacey's chart, which you may not remember it, but is a steep downward curve in terms of incarceration rates, at the same time that Finland was having a very similar relative spike in its homicide rate and serious violent crime rate, not in raw numbers the same, but in relative to its prior baselines, a similar magnitude spike in crime. And yet you did not see a policy initiative like ours. And just to point out the obvious, Finland is a much more racially and ethnically homogenous society than the United States, which may well play a role in it. I think we have time for one last question. Professor Sampson in the back.
About whether anyone could comment on the perhaps unproblematic use of mass incarceration. Two of you invoked Vaquant, but as you probably know, he seriously criticizes that concept because of the fact that it's so concentrated within particular groups, right? So we wouldn't refer to mass poverty at 1% of the population. It's true that it's concentrated in specific groups, but part of his logic, and maybe a question is, isn't that precisely the point? And does it bear on your comment, Bernard, on tolerability? That is to say, if incarceration were to penetrate the middle class, the upper class population, at any level of near what it is in the lower class, we would have a totally different reaction. So I guess what I'm saying is, and what Vaquant argues, which since you invoked him, it seems that one wants to address it, is that mass incarceration is in fact a very misleading concept, yet it's been used very uncritically. So it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
So the term that Vaquant uses and that was in my text is hyper-incarceration of subproletariat African-American young men, I think. I had to cut it out because it's pretty good. It's hyper-incarceration of subproletariat African-American young men. That's right. And you're right, Rob. I think we're using the term mass incarceration as a placeholder for the phenomenon, which causes a problem that you've identified, and I think that's right. Yeah.
I think just to close this panel, because we're done, we're more than done, but to say that I think one of the reasons, the political reason that it's used, is to try to underscore the massive change and revolutionary nature of this practice relative to our own previous baseline and relative to the experience of other countries. It's been a wonderful panel. Please join me in thanking them. And our next wonderful panel will begin at 4:30.